Hello everyone, my name is Graham Johnson, and today I'll be discussing the paper Wi-Fly, Detecting Privacy Invasion Attacks by Consumer Drones by Simon Birnbach, Richard Baker, and Ivan Martinovic. This was presented at the Networked and Distributed Systems Symposium in 2016. So, what are we going to be talking about? First, we're going to define what are Small Unmanned Aerial Systems, or SUAS, or Small Unmanned Aerial Vehicles as they're referred to in the paper. I'm going to use the term SUAS as that is the term used by the Federal Aviation Administration. Second, how prevalent are SUAS? Third, SUAS invasions of privacy. Some examples. And fourth, what is considered out of scope for this presentation? After we talk through the background, we're going to talk about the problem statement of the paper and then move on to the solutions. The first solution being how do we model SUAS invasions of privacy, identifying SUAS operations of proximity, and overcoming SUAS invasion methods, which can be used by the attacker to evade our solution. Finally, we're going to go into the experimental design, the results, and then the conclusion. What are SUAS, or small UAVs? Well, based on the FAA guidance, I've developed a very simplified definition. An SUAS is a user-operated or independent autonomous aerial vehicle that is either fixed-wing or rotary powered, weighs less than 55 pounds, and may carry an external payload. As you can see on the screen, I provided two examples of an SUAS, one fixed-wing and one rotary powered. So, how prevalent are SUAS? In the United States, the FAA has released a fact sheet on 24 May 21, which shows that there are over 872,000 drones registered, of which over 507,000 of them are actually recreational drones. And with all these drones, there are 229,000 remotely certified pilots. As you can see, there are also a large number of manufacturers. So the Research and Development Corporation in 2020 released the following data in a survey of SUAS. The Research and Development Corporation does studies for the Department of Defense and other departments that deal with national security for the United States. And as you can see, there are a large number of actual SUAS that are not classified as prototypes, with over 1,400. Additionally, there are a large number of manufacturers that produce these SUAS, with over 564. What are some SUAS invasions of privacy? So in Seattle, a woman called the police after spotting a drone flying in front of her 26th floor apartment window, and it had been observing her when she was partially undressed inside. And in 2015, a Kentucky judge ruled that a man had the right to shoot down a drone over his house as it was an invasion of his privacy. However, he was also ordered to pay an $800 fine and restitution towards the drone operator. So, what is considered out of scope for this presentation? First is detection of SUAS using means not focused on in the paper. So while the paper briefly touches on these, they're not going to be further discussed down the road. First is the use of radar. So radar works by sending out a signal and getting that signal back, kind of like how sonar works in the ocean. And functionally, the radar for detecting SUAS uses very high frequency methods and is not very economical. Second is video camera video analysis. So this requires using video cameras and having an individual or algorithm look for an SUAS. This is not very cost effective as it requires a large number of video cameras. So again, will not be discussed further. There's also hybrid radar and video analysis approaches, which kind of combine radar and video analysis. And again, it's cost prohibitive for the purposes of this paper. There's also acoustic arrays, and while they're more cost effective than both radar, video camera, and hybrid approaches, they're still not entirely cost effective. The one discussed in the paper was over $2,000, and they're not simple to set up. Additionally, there's the use of protocol signatures on unencrypted Wi-Fi to detect SUAS. This was not discussed because more and more SUAS protocols are being encrypted, so it's not an effective means. Additionally, this would require also cataloging an entire database of SUAS protocols and MAC addresses, which is not effective. Finally, this will not be discussing kinetic and non-kinetic counter SUAS strategies. So these are command signal hijacking, which again may not be effective, especially for encrypted protocols. Jamming, which is highly illegal in the United States and many other countries under the Federal Communications Commission. Electromagnetic pulses, use of munitions such as shotguns, bow and arrow, or what have you, and then other kinetic methods of actually disabling SUAS. Again, the purpose of this paper is to detect and allow the individual to respond, not to disable or destroy. Additionally, we will not be discussing countering sophisticated uses of SUAS. These include legitimate military and law enforcement use, used by criminal entities such as the Yakuza, which use SUAS for drug smuggling, and used by other non-state actors, such as terrorist, non-government organizations, etc. However, if you are interested in these methods, there's additional reading through the DoD Counter SUAS Policy, as well as the Department of Homeland Security Counter SUAS Technology Guide. Moving on to the problem statement, the paper asks, how do we provide the consumer with a method to detect and respond to invasions of privacy from SUAS? This method should be easy to deploy, provide a timely notification to the user, minimize false positives, and be inexpensive. I broke this up into 3 sub-problems. The first is, how do we model SUAS invasions of privacy? How do we develop a model to identify SUAS operations proximity? And finally, how do we overcome SUAS evasion methods? Moving on, here are our adversary model assumptions. First, the attacker will be using a COTS unaltered SUAS, COTS meaning commercial off-the-shelf. Second, the attacker doesn't have physical access to the location. Therefore, the attacker will have some sort of launch distance required to get the SUAS between them and the target. Third, there is some standoff distance required between the SUAS and the targeted location. Therefore, there will be a surveillance distance. Fourth, the attacker may vary flight patterns, such as speed and direction, to evade detection. Fifth, detection flows will be high bandwidth, because the attacker is streaming video data. Sixth, the attacker establishes line of sight with the target at some point. If they don't establish line of sight, then they can't see within the target building, and there's no invasion of privacy. And finally, there will be some sort of noise associated with the detection reading. Therefore, we need to ensure that when we are detecting the SUAS, that our model accounts for this. We can break down the SUAS invasion of privacy into 3 phases of attack. The first being approach, the second surveillance, and the final escape. We use the following model variables to help us further define the SUAS attack. For example, we have the distance launched, or launch distance, DL, which is the total distance between the target and where the attacker launches it. The surveillance distance being the distance between the target and the drone when it stops and is in the surveillance phase of the attack. The detection range is when we can actually detect it with our wireless access point. The field of view, which is our wireless access point's field of view outside of the window into this example. The Vmax, or maximum velocity. The packet transmission rate, which is the data transmission rate. The transmission frequency F, as well as the transmission window size W. We will assume that the wireless receiver will scan only the frequencies 2.4 GHz and 5.8 GHz, and therefore the attacker is transmitting in these spectrums. And as you can see below, there is a basic overview of the detection model. So there's pre-processing, where we'll separate the flows, and then filter by throughput or packet rate. Then we'll move on to our statistical tests, which is the movement test and the free space propagation test. And finally, we'll go into attack analysis, where we will determine the phase of attack, as well as let the user know through a proximity alert. Looking further into the detection algorithm, we will first separate flows by MAC address. And once we have separated the flows, we will filter for high bandwidth flows. As we assumed in our adversary model, the attacker will be streaming that high fidelity data, so there should be pretty high bandwidth. Next, we move on to our statistical tests. First is the movement test. Functionally, if we want to see movement, we want to see low short-term deviations and high long-term deviations in the received signal strength, or RSS. And this can be modeled by the short time window is the minimum of the window size and the standard deviation, which should be bigger than some noise. Next, we have the free space propagation test, which is kind of outlined in the figure to the right. And functionally, we are making sure that is actually moving in free space and not static as well. Finally, our detection algorithm finishes with the attack analysis phase. First, we'll determine the attack phase. And this will be done by using delta x, which is the change in distance from the target. And when delta x is greater than 0, then we assume that it is approaching, whereas if delta x is less than 0, it is escaping. The proximity alert should trigger when delta x is 0. There's no change in the minimum window size, as the SUAS is now in surveillance mode. Please note that it will actually fail if the standard deviation of either the free space propagation test, WS, or the movement test, WL, is either less than or greater than the noise, respectively. And as you can see on the right, we can see the actual versus effective velocity of a zigzag pattern. And due to the effective velocity being much lower than the actual velocity, this will impact our window size and will make it much harder to detect the SUAS. The solution is creating a detection algorithm that changes WS and WL. When we start the algorithm, we don't know what S is defined as, so we don't have the phase. So we increase WL until we reach Vmax, take the sample standard deviation size of WS, and verify that it's less than the square root of 2 times the noise. And we'll also take the sample standard deviation of WL and ensure that it is greater than the square root of 2 times the noise. So if both of those are true, then we will determine the phase. So the phase of the window length is greater than 0, then we assume it's approaching, but we also make sure we check to ensure that it's not in that proximity or it's in the surveillance phase. And if it's in the surveillance phase, we'll actually replace the window. Otherwise, if the phase is greater than 0, then we'll assume it's in the escape phase. Now that we've established our detection algorithm, we can discuss some simulated results. So as you can see in the first figure on our left, the WL length and WS lengths are critical to ensuring that we can actually detect the SUAS. As you can see, the solid line here is actually the detection threshold, where if the standard deviation is not above it, then the SUAS will not be detected. Therefore, WL of 1 second is somewhat effective, a WL of 5 seconds is very effective, and WS of 0.0725 seconds is not very effective at all. It barely detects the SUAS. Moving on to the right-hand side, we see delta X versus the signal versus time. So as we would assume, the attacker would approach, they would stop moving and reach their surveillance phase, and then they would escape. Now we've defined our detection algorithm, let's move on to the experimental design. First, we have the sensors, which are going to be a Raspberry Pi A with a USB Wi-Fi adapter, and there will be 2 sensors deployed. The first sensor will be deployed at a window, at the lower window of this individual's house, and the upper sensor will be deployed at a higher window. As you can see, there's an outside view and inside view of how the sensors are laid out. Next, we're going to move on to the SUAS models that are going to be used. First, we're going to use the DJI Phantom 3 Standard Edition, as well as the Parrot Bebop. These 2 were chosen because of their popularity back in 2016. Finally, we're going to discuss the approaches. So, there's a standard straight approach, a zigzag approach, a non-line of sight approach over the roof, as well as a non-line of sight approach around the house. And now displays the back and forth approach, which follows a very similar flight path to the straight approach. As you can see in Table 4, which is talking about the DJI Phantom 3 experiment series from the paper, while the intent of the experimenters were to use the exact same variables due to the dynamic nature of flying an SUAS, they were not entirely able to ensure that they had the exact same speed or launch distance. However, this was done over 3 launches for each approach. Additionally, they made a couple of assumptions. They assumed the surveillance distance was 1 meter, and they stayed between 1 and 2 meters of the window. They also assumed that there would be detected around 50 meters. The window size would be 0.1 second, as well as a couple of different window lengths that were given standard across the recordings that were outside of the algorithm. They also used values for theta of 1.75 and then a proximity alert value of 10. The first experimental results we'll discuss are for the straight approach. So as you can see in the first figure on our left, we used some standard lengths for 5 seconds, 15 seconds, and 10 seconds. Due to the simplicity of the straight approach, the paper opted not to use the calculated values for WL and WS. As you can see, they're detected pretty much all at the same time, and they do a pretty good job of keeping the same effectiveness as the SUAS approaches. And then at 5, it will actually go into that surveillance mode, so we shouldn't detect anything. And then as it departs in 6. And looking at the delta X over time, we see that we have a pretty standard detection. However, the lower WL of 5 seconds is less effective than the higher 10 and 15 second WLs. But they both do a pretty good job once it starts going to the surveillance phase of showing no movement, and then again showing the escape. Moving on, let's discuss the zigzag approach. So the paper provides 2 figures that are used to discuss the experimental results. So the first is the figure on the left, which uses parameters derived from Vmax and Veffective, 30.225 seconds and 6.15 seconds respectively. And the figure on the right uses the system parameters of 5 seconds and 10 seconds. So as you can see, the Veffective is slightly more effective than Vmax. So we're seeing very large standard deviation swings when we use the Vmax, whereas Veffective does detect it slightly sooner, and it does actually detect the surveillance phase almost immediately, as shown in the graph. So moving over to our pre-positioned system parameters, 5 and 10 seconds both model this much better than some of the higher system parameters, so that's why they were used. And we can see a very similar outline to our Veffective versus a very wild outline using Vmax. Moving on to the back and forth approach. As you can see by the 2 graphs below, they use a very similar methodology as with the zigzag approach methodology, with the figure on the left using parameters derived from Vmax and Veffective, and the figure on the right using system parameters, in this case 30 seconds and 5 seconds. So as you can see, the Vmax is slightly more effective overall at detecting the drone, whereas in this case the Veffective is slightly less effective at detecting the drone. However, it does detect it sooner, and it does a better job of detecting that surveillance window at 0.2. Moving on to the system parameters, the paper discusses that 30 seconds in this case may be about the sweet spot for detecting the SUAS. However, again, there's a very similar issue where the SUAS isn't necessarily detected when it's in that surveillance phase until late in the game. Continuing our discussion of the back and forth approach, we can see that the 5-second WL does a much better job than the 30-second WL at actually detecting the changes between the exposition of the SUAS. As you can see, the negative being the escape and the positive being the forward momentum or the approach. The larger value of WL doesn't actually show that there's any good back and forth. It just says that it's slowing down. The final approach discussed is the non-line of sight approach. And for here, actually just used the system parameters of 5 and 10 seconds, as the experimenters discovered that the lower WL lengths were much more effective than the calculated values. So as you can see, both 10 and 5 seconds detect around the same time, and they're relatively quick at detecting the SUAS, as well as good at modeling the surveillance behavior and the escape. Finally, what are the paper's takeaways? There are really 3 key takeaways from the paper. First, detection ranges were greater than they anticipated, and proximity sensors were triggered for all experiments. As you can see in the figure to the right, table 6 from the paper, the detection range was estimated to be about 50 meters, and all except for the third back and forth, it was detected further than 50 meters. Additionally, detection parameters must be carefully selected so the escape phase isn't identified early. So as we discussed in a couple of previous slides, if we have those higher WLs, then sometimes the escape is triggered early, whereas if we have the lower WL, it does a better job of actually identifying the surveillance and escape phases. The third final takeaway is that while takeoff indicates movement, detection can actually begin prior to takeoff because there's data transmission. So the experimenters believe that one of the reasons why the SUAS was detected so early was actually because the algorithm was detecting and processing the flow so early. In other cases where there was no actual large data transmission, it would be much harder to detect the SUAS. Thank you for watching my presentation. All sources are linked below in this slide or the next slide. Additionally, all sources and the slides they pertain to are also linked in the notes. These slides and the paper can be found in the description below. Thank you for your time and attention.